It is 11 o'clock at night, and I'm sitting in my truck talking to myself like a friggin' weirdo, just hoping that someone doesn't crack open my windshield while I'm not looking. Which actually brings us to the topic of today's video, which is law and order and criminal justice, and how a Christian voter should look at the issue. So, lots of fun. Let's get to it. So today we're going to keep things pretty high altitude. We're not going to get super duper in the weeds of types of punishment, capital punishment, whether or not that's a biblical position. We're just going to keep it a little vague and might be a little bit less intense than last week where we kicked things off with talking about abortion. Hopefully it'll be a little bit cooler heads on this one. So we're going to read through a few passages here. I'm going to put all these references down in the description. And I'm going to give you kind of my take on what I think they are saying the Christian position ought to be regarding the issue of justice. And I will give you your everyman's very subjective assessment of the two major political parties' current positions on the issue. And I'll give you my final verdict. So, starting off with Romans 13, which says, "Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Therefore you must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes." Yay. "For they are God's ministers attending continually to this very thing. Render therefore to all their due, taxes to whom taxes are due, custom to whom customs, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor." So that's kind of the key passage for this topic, but I do have a few more kind of sprinkled throughout here. So Proverbs 18 tells us that it is not good to show partiality to the wicked or to overthrow the righteous in judgment. Deuteronomy 27:19 says, "Cursed is the one who perverts the justice due to the stranger, the fatherless, and widow." And Leviticus 19:15 says, "You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty. In righteousness you shall judge your neighbor." And of course we have the commandment that says to honor your father and mother. Honor your father and mother. And when you really understand that in the spirit of the law, that is not just applying to your flesh and blood mother and father, but also to all those who have authority over you, rightful authority. So, what do I think those things are saying? I'll have those and more references down below for you guys to check out. But I want this to be a little bit more discussion and not just a read-along here. So what do I think we're learning from these selected passages here? Well, I think the Christian position is clearly not one of anarchy. So we clearly have to support some sort of justice, some sort of system of justice, whether we like it or not. As much as you may want your extreme libertarian dream, it's not biblical, my man. So you're going to have to follow some laws and you're going to have to pay some taxes, whether you like it or not. You are to obey the law, with rare exceptions, because actually there is one other passage. Acts 5:29 says, "But Peter and the other apostles answered and said, 'We ought to obey God rather than men.'" So there are instances where it may be justifiable to disobey. But how that disobedience looks like and what those instances are a topic of another video. So we're not going to get too far into when a Christian can disobey the law. We're just going to emphasize that in general you should be obeying the law. We ought to be pro-rule of law. So the Old Testament especially, time and time and time again, hammers home that you should not be having this preferential treatment, either for those who are poor and lowly, or for those who are rich and mighty and powerful in society. You ought to judge according to deeds done, no matter who it is. So that's going to come up in my breakdown. Pro-law enforcement. So, sorry, defund policers. The Christian position is generally to support law enforcement. And that's not to say that there aren't problems, that you can't call for reforms, that you can't call for a better law enforcement system. I think there are many problems with the American, not just justice system, but a lot of law enforcement. Especially, I've heard an example recently where a couple of different police unions have protected dirty cops and cops that were doing the wrong thing that definitely should not have been brought back onto the force. But the police union stepped in and said, hey, you can't fire this guy. He's part of the union. He pays his dues. He's got certain protections. And they got him either a job back at that department or they found him a job at another department not too far away. So, again, not trying to get too in the weeds, but in general, we are to be pro-law enforcement. And we are also to be in support of punishing crime. We have a lot of leniency that we deal with these days. But Christians should believe in punishing criminals. I understand why some people might think that, we should try to rehabilitate. I think rehabilitation only goes so far, and this is a very personal take here. I am so sick of seeing violent criminals just let out time and time and time again that end up committing worse and worse crimes as time goes on and they learn that they can just get away with it. So I have become more of a fan of a three-strike system where if you are a violent criminal of any violence whatsoever and you have committed violence 3 times, I think you should be locked away for the rest of your natural life. You get to turn big rocks into little rocks for the rest of your life. You get to stamp license plates for the rest of your life. Or if you're bad enough, well, we'll talk about that another day. But yeah, there's clearly a difference between the two major positions right now. But I think this is actually an issue that really frustrates me, I think, more than others. Because I really think that in the not too distant future, there really wasn't all that much daylight between Republicans and Democrats on this issue. I think, in general, most Americans, regardless of who you ultimately voted for, were generally pro-law and order. And I think it's been a slow burn for many decades, but it's only really been the last probably 10, 15, 20 years that I think it's gotten particularly bad. And so what am I discussing? Well, our first point of difference between the two camps here is their general stance on crime. You got the Republican position, which tends to be more tough on crime, and the Democratic position, which tends to be more soft on crime. Why do I say that? Well, let me preface this with saying, yes, there are certainly exceptions. You're going to get people that are like, J6, Trump pardoned all the J6. Okay, but we also saw most of them being hunted down to the ends of the earth, and some of them given ridiculous sentences for standing around being there. I'm not saying all of them were doing that. Yes, some were fighting cops and they should be in prison and should probably still be in prison. For the record, I think the blanket pardon was not a good move. I think there are probably at least a handful that should be still in prison. I think the pardon makes sense. You know, you can make a good case for a number of people. I don't have an issue with pardoning in certain instances. I think that was an instance where some people were clearly being held as political prisoners. And if they did deserve some kind of punishment, they didn't deserve the length of punishment that they got. But anyways, I'm getting too tied up on that. So, but the left, it's become the norm, where we have lenient judges, we have soft district attorneys in power all over this country, and you see time and time again reports of criminals who are being booked now because they've murdered some poor girl, and they had previously been in jail or been at least arrested 14 times, 20 times, 50 times. I saw one that was at least 70 prior arrests, and this dude was still out on the street. And why is that? It's because where I think both sides were more focused on actual justice at one point in our not too distant past, the left, by and large, has become obsessed with social justice. And social justice is not real justice, and it is definitely not biblical justice. Because biblical justice starts with God's law, the moral law. If you don't know what that is, think of the Ten Commandments. That's the fundamentals of biblical justice. That's the very beginning of it. And whereas social justice, by their own definition on Google here, justice in terms of the distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privileges within a society. I'm going to stop there. Basically, redistribution is the big focus here, of not just money and resources, but all kinds of things to achieve equity. So this is a topic that will be discussed at length in the future, but not today. But that has become the left's primary concern, and that is why you see people who happen to be of a particular appearance are being let off the hook more and more and more by certain judges, while others get the book thrown at them. And clearly, that is a perversion of justice. That is showing partiality, like we mentioned earlier. That is an indefensible position for a Christian. If you support considering, oh, he had a rough upbringing, oh, he's, disadvantaged because he's this particular people group, it doesn't matter. Biblically speaking, what did they do? What is the proper punishment for that type of crime? That's what he gets. No matter what he looks like, or she, where they came from, what their circumstance, if they did the crime, they do the time. No cash bail is another big thing for the left, which also helps a lot of these crazies get back out on the street. Really common to downgrade charges, and I'm not trying to act like people who are more conservative have never downgraded charges. They do. But Alvin Bragg, if you don't recognize that name, that's the guy that was trying to get Trump up in New York in Manhattan. He was the district attorney in Manhattan. Still is, I think. He came in, and their people who work with him were reporting that he made it a point to start downgrading a lot of felony charges down to misdemeanors, and a lot of misdemeanors to basically hand wave them, make them go away. So, I'm not saying there's never a time for that necessarily, but in general, it's way too common for the left. And we also see a major difference between the two in their general stance towards law enforcement. So, where the right is more pro-law enforcement, they generally support the blue, the left is either very skeptical at best, or they are rabidly anti-cop, and they promote these ridiculous community policing suggestions when there's nothing wrong with the regular police department. Okay, not that there's nothing wrong, but with the concept of the police department. For crying out loud, you had the Black Lives Matter riots. You've got the ACAB slogan, and that is not a right-wing slogan. Very anti-law enforcement. Now, there are certain groups, the ATF comes to mind, that catch hell from the right. And maybe it's somewhat justified, maybe not. So the right needs to watch themselves too. But in general, they're very pro-law enforcement. And not all on the left are against law enforcement. I know there are still pro-law enforcement members of the left. But they are becoming more and more the minority. Specifically, when you look at ICE, is another extension, I guess, of this point here. ICE are enforcing already on the books immigration law. You may not like how they're doing it, but everyone who has come across that border has committed a crime. No matter what you say, it has violated American law. They are criminals. It may be a misdemeanor under certain circumstances, but they have still broken the law, and they have to suffer some kind of consequence for that. And you can disagree with maybe a certain method that ICE uses, but if you're going to oppose enforcing immigration law at all, you are not holding a Christian position. And before you come at me with the Bible teaches to be kind to strangers, we're going to talk about that another day. Immigration's a whole other video. So in general, I see from the right a little bit more of a focus on swift, harsh application of law in order to promote security and protect innocent people out in public, whereas on the left, there's more focus on you have to be compassionate. You have to consider their circumstances of life. They're more focused on prevention instead of the after effect. They're more focused on rehabilitation, no matter how bad the recidivism rate is. And I think, and they tend to be more averse to handing down harsh punishments or punishments at all. And a good example of this is President Bukele down in El Salvador. Which side loves him? Which side hates him? The right loves him. Why? Because El Salvador used to be one of the murder capitals of the world. It used to be a horrific place to live because you had MS-13 running all over the place, making life hell. And so what did Bukele do? Well, he came in and he said, all right, no more. And this is a very devout Christian man. And they rounded up anyone who even remotely was associated with the gang and threw them in supermax prisons, where they are probably going to spend the rest of their lives. And I don't have an issue with that. And, okay, we can sit here and yell at each other over, well, they weren't given their due process. Okay, first of all, I don't know what the El Salvador laws say exactly you need to do. But look at the results, man. You threw all these troublemakers in jail. You got them off the streets. El Salvador, overnight, went from a murder capital to completely safe. All these people that whine and complain about, I don't feel safe to walk around outside at night. Okay, let us throw violent criminals in jail. Let us keep them in jail forever if necessary. Because you know what it's done to this little country? It is so safe now. It is experiencing a renaissance there. Kids are walking to school. Businesses have reopened all over the place. The dude is like the most popular leader in the world amongst his own people. So much so, when it came time to elect a new president, even though it technically wasn't constitutional, everyone was like, you know what? We want him again. I know you can only go for one term here, but they re-elected him and said, we don't care. He stays. He has done something amazing and protected us. But what do you see on the left? You see groups like Amnesty International freaking out because this dude just threw thousands of gangsters in prison with no foreseeable release date for any of them. So I don't know if there is some kind of process, if they're starting to kind of weed out who might not actually belong in there or not. I don't know. I don't care, because Chef Kiss as to what it's done for his country. And you know what? If El Salvador doesn't want him, I think he's welcome to come up here and spend some time up here with us and give us a few pointers. But in general, I think it's pretty obvious which side I take. Obviously, most of these videos, I'm going to be making the case for why you should side with the GOP. That is not to say they will always stay that way. And that is not to say that they are perfect. Because when I say that you need to vote Republican, I say that through gritted teeth. Because there are many things that they do that I frustrates me to no end. But abortion is undoubtedly one that you need to vote Republican for. And the basic ideas of crime and punishment, you ought to vote Republican for the foreseeable future. Because these Soros judges, these Soros DAs ain't doing it. All this criminal justice reform to give hugs and kisses and let brutal murderers back out on the street to kill again ain't working. And is that a bit of a caricature? Maybe, but not much. And I don't care. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you guys next time.